Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Spooky Cloder, the Dark Ether Files podcast, and welcome to the first installment of a multi-part series simply titled A Critique of Terminator Dark Fate. Or, as my co-host, Special Agent Carter Sauce refers to it as...
Terminator Dark Fate? More like Terminator Fate.
Over the next several months, I will be breaking down and critiquing Dark Fate in an attempt to better understand why I despise this film as much as I do. And in an effort to be as fair as possible and not have this series boil down to just me raging about how much I dislike this movie, I'll be including segments from a few friends of the channel and my co-hosts who enjoy and dislike the movie at random intervals. It's going to serve as a good balance and give meaningful perspectives on the subject matter. With that said, I'm going to provide some small context and backstory of my personal experience with the Terminator franchise, as well as some discussion that sets the stage for how and why Dark Fate came out the way it did. But if you just want to get to the review, then feel free to skip to this time code right here. From the age of 10, I was exposed to the world of Arnold Schwarzenegger films. The first film I seen him in was the 1987 classic Predator. Long story short, the viewing of this film served as a gateway to introduce me to other films he was a part of, the biggest one being Terminator. The first Terminator film I watched was Terminator 2: Judgment Day. Funny enough, this seemed to have been a common trend. I remember being very hyped and excited to watch more Terminator films too. So much so that my father and I would regularly seek out collector stores looking for Terminator figures. As time went along, I watched the rest of the films of the franchise, and long story short, I grew a deep appreciation for the films, or more specifically, the first two installments. So you can imagine my displeasure when the later sequels seemingly failed to retain the spirit and essence of the franchise that made it feel iconic in the first place. To put it in simple terms, these Terminator sequels began to feel more and more disconnected from the core message of the franchise as they were being released. Salvation was the only sequel that felt more in line with Terminator, and even though it has its fair share of issues that we will get to, it was able to escape the T2 formula that has plagued every other installment thus far. With that said, there was something more at work that ultimately undermined Dark Fate, and it went beyond simply being a badly written movie. After Terminator Genisys failed to kick off Paramount's planned trilogy involving the recast of Sarah and Kyle, along with whatever Arnie was supposed to be.
I thought you were dead.
No. Just upgraded.
It seemed the filmmakers didn't learn from their mistakes, as the next installment of the Terminator franchise would once again be set in the present day. However, this time something was different. A series of events and choices would affect this new film in ways the previous sequels didn't experience. First, James Cameron was coming back, albeit in a limited role, but this would be the first time in a long time that Cameron would be involved in a Terminator film that wasn't merely a producer credit. Second, it was set to ignore previous sequels and directly connect to the first two installments. Third, the film would focus on a modern-day issue that was a big point of contention at the time this movie was being made and then released.
And now, a message from your governor.
Good evening. As you know, I have dealt with many aliens in the past, but now you criticize me about the Mexico alien. Here, I show you how the great state of California has dealt with the Mexico border issue.
Fourth, and not too far from the third, this film would deal in the dreaded identity politics trade. Now, while Genisys had its moments with identity politics, it was nowhere near the levels of BS that Dark Fate would get into. As most of you already know, when a film in a long-running franchise decides to dip its proverbial toes in the pool of identity politics, it doesn't end well. Regardless, the first trailer released to mixed reactions, and director Tim Miller had some interesting things to say about one of the leads, Grace, played by the same woman who played in Blade Runner 2049. Jesus, talk about a downgrade.
Now listen, Carl, whatever you do, don't stare at him.
I'm staring at him. Is that a man?
Actually, it's 7 men. Parts of them anyway.
So Tim Miller is quoted as saying, "If you're at all enlightened, she'll play like gangbusters. If you're a closet misogynist, she'll scare the f*** out of you, because she's tough and strong, but very feminine. We did not train certain gender roles for others. She's just very strong, and that frightens some dudes." Right. Didn't trade gender traits for others.
Is that a man?
In a later interview, he also said the following in response to the fan backlash. "Yeah, and unfortunately I think it is a small minority, but it is a very vocal minority. And they make a lot of noise, and it is hard." You know, I always find it funny when these directors and show media companies chalk up the negative responses they get for their crap projects to being from a small vocal minority. Now, after being in this field of understanding the workings of identity politics in our culture for as long as it's been around, you can pick up on certain phrases and trends. For example, if you have a Hollywood production whose biggest marketing for an upcoming project centers around how diverse its cast is going to be, you can bet top dollars that the story might be hot garbage. Usually, when you release a trailer for a movie, it's to get the audience excited and intrigued and even invested in the story to come. Lately, however, many trailers these days and the words surrounding them involve being diverse and inclusive to certain groups. And most of the time, it's a remake or a sequel to a previously established franchise that features tokenized variants of popular characters or entirely new characters being promoted solely because they are diverse. And this is the point where most intelligent people walk away. We've seen this kind of trend in franchises ranging from Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Star Trek, Doctor Who, the MCU, and of course now, Terminator. The point is, and this goes without saying, updating or creating new stories for the modern audience is a kiss of death for your project. Instead of focusing on entertaining the public, Hollywood has opted to lecture the public of social and political issues, which in turn has ruined a lot of the industry. And because you have a lot of ignorant fans that blindly consume whatever is put in front of them, calling out obvious problems with the project is now being labeled as toxic fans, entitled fandom, or being relegated to one of the numerous ists and phobes that have been invented.
You asshole.
Along with these labels are those that advocate and proclaim that these social and political engineering schemes are necessary because
Not about money. It's about
A message.
Of course, that's not to say there haven't been messages put into entertainment in the past. It's just that filmmakers back then were smart enough to realize that it's better to convince your audience to think rather than what to think. Instead of telling the audience what was good or bad, they left that thought and choice in your hands. These days, though, this concept is few and far between, and this is due mostly to the fact that Hollywood is dominated and ran by one predominant political side in a state that is also dominated and ran by one predominant political side. It's almost an everyday occurrence to have some popular actor come out and voice support for or condemn someone or something. It's either anti-Trump rhetoric or reparations for slavery in the US. You know, back in the day, filmmakers and actors were smart enough to keep their political beliefs to themselves for the most part, because they knew alienating your audience with something as divisive as politics could spell doom for your project's performance. All of this had a part to play in how Terminator Dark Fate played out. Now, with that preliminary context out, let's go ahead and dive into the rabbit hole of Terminator Dark Fate. Terminator Dark Fate opens with reused footage of Sarah's taped session with Dr. Silberman in T2. It's actually a little ironic because the way Sarah was in that scene there almost perfectly lines up with how she ends up being in this film. And yes, that means Sarah Connor has little to no character development. More on this later. We continue with a voiceover from modern day Sarah Connor talking about Judgment Day and what her and John did at Cyberdyne. This is paired with a shot of a beach littered with human remains and Skynet's Terminators and Hunter Killers marching on shore. This is almost reminiscent of D-Day in World War II, and while it is an interesting shot in concept, I can't get over how cheap the CGI looks. I mean, Jesus Christ, look at it, it looks like a mediocre video game render. How is it that the CGI of T2 still holds up better than the stuff we've received in the future? And why is it that these T-800s have to be CGI renders? Could they not have just used some practical models? But I digress. The scene then cuts to a Guatemalan beach in 1998. This scene is set 3 years after the events of T2, and we see a digitally de-aged Sarah and John. And dear God, what exactly am I looking at?
She looks just like you, but old and flabby.
I don't know what it is, but even though the technology has advanced, this shot still doesn't look much better than Rogue One's Princess Leia. John looks alright, I guess. Then we get to see another de-aged Arnie bot walk from behind Sarah, and he shoots John at point-blank range with a shotgun. Sarah tries to stop him, but is completely powerless. The T-800 finishes him off and drops the gun and just walks away. Okay, first off, where did this thing come from? How is he here? And why did he just kill John and walk away? Also, why didn't he kill Sarah too? Okay, think about it. The goal of sending the Terminator is to ultimately ensure the survival of Skynet. The mission of the first two Terminators was to eliminate John Connor and thus have Skynet win the war of enslaving humanity with no organized resistance to fight it. We can assume, based on a logical progression of events, that because this T-800 successfully killed John Connor, Skynet has won. Despite the fact that Cyberdyne has been destroyed, the last T-800 programmed by Skynet can now ensure that Skynet will be created. If Cyberdyne was able to create Skynet from a broken CPU chip and severed arm of a 1984 T-800, then imagine how fast Skynet could be created because of the presence of this new T-800. The T-800 will most likely have some kind of programming to ensure this happens. Thus, a new Dark Fate has been created. A Dark Fate where Skynet can enslave and eventually eliminate humanity. Right? Right? Well, if you guessed the complete opposite, then congrats. You're smarter than this film's writers. I've seen a lot of people who defend this movie and defend this opening in particular as being necessary for the franchise to progress. Opinions like, because John Connor was poorly mishandled in previous films, the only solution was to wipe the slate clean and start fresh, have come up multiple times. I'm going to break down why this is not only a stupid idea, but an unnecessary one. If you feel it reasonable to kill off one of, if not the most pivotal figure in a franchise that's had a total of 6 big screen installments and a TV show in an effort to reinvigorate the franchise, maybe it's time to put it on the shelf and let its legacy be.
Let it go. Let it go.
Because as Dark Fate has shown us, not only did the movie not reinvigorate the franchise, it just might have put it to bed. The response to John's death and to his apparent successor alone have generated more sentiment of leaving the franchise with just the first 2 films and ignore the rest. And let's set the record straight. The death of one major character alone is not why this movie is a failure. My problems with Dark Fate extend far beyond its opening. The death of John Connor was not just some death. It was a character assassination. And I want you guys to remember this point as we will revisit it later. For now, let's call it there. If this series is something that has piqued your interest, then I encourage you to stay tuned as next time we're going to be diving more into the story of Dark Fate. A special thank you to our Patreon supporters, Mother Mulder and Kyle Curtis Flett. We appreciate your continued dedication to our channel and content. And with that being said, remember that the future is not set, and there is no fate but what we make for ourselves, because the entertainment is out there.
Stay here. I'll be back.